This is Up. I'm David Gura. The Attorney General Bill Barr says the special counsel's report, some 400 pages in length, will be sent to lawmakers by mid-April with redactions. That's not good enough for top Democratic lawmakers who have set an April 2nd deadline for the Justice Department to provide the entire report and its underlying evidence. The lawmakers are scheduled to be on recess from April 13th to April 28th. Less than a week after the Attorney General released his summary memo of Robert Mueller's main findings, a lot of questions remain about the special counsel's investigation. The decision not to subpoena the president is one of the lingering mysteries of Mueller's 22-month investigation, which concluded last week when he filed a report numbering more than 300 pages. Philip Rucker, The Washington Post, continues. The president's lawyers now believe keeping their client from sitting down with investigators was their greatest victory. Robert Mueller was reportedly pushing for an interview with the president as late as December of last year, but his legal team feared their client would perjure himself and managed to dodge the potential sit-down. One former lawyer, John Dowd, allegedly told the president, "Don't testify. It's either that or an orange jumpsuit." I'm going to quote from Bill Barr's memo on obstruction of justice. The special counsel states that while this report does not conclude the president committed a crime, it also does not exonerate him. Can't say that enough. The Post cites legal experts who say an interview with the president would have been pivotal to helping assess whether the president had corrupt intent, a key element of such a charge. Phil Rucker, as I said, the Washington Post White House bureau chief, joins us now from Washington, D.C. Phil, it's a great piece, extensively reported by you and your colleagues there at the Post. Help us understand why this didn't happen. We heard talk of a subpoena happening, of the efforts the special counsel would take to get the president to sit down for this interview. Why did they give up, as it seems they did?
Well, David, hopefully in the full Mueller report that we might see later next month, we'll get some answers to those questions. The internal debates inside the Department of Justice are being tightly held now, and we're not sure. But there are a couple of factors that were at play. One is that the special counsel Mueller was not operating with full independence. He was a subordinate to the Deputy Attorney General, Rod Rosenstein, who was a Trump political appointee. Rosenstein, throughout this process, faced incredible political pressure publicly, both from Republicans in Congress and from the White House. And any decision to subpoena the president would have had to have the approval of Rosenstein. Now, secondly, if Mueller were to have subpoenaed the president, it likely would have invited a court challenge. The Trump's lawyers made that very clear, that they were going to take this all the way to the Supreme Court if they had to. And so Mueller would have needed to have a real justification for doing this interview, for obtaining information from the interview with the president that he could not have obtained elsewhere through documents or through interviews with other witnesses. And so what the Trump lawyers did is they tried to drown the special counsel with information. They cooperated with all these document requests. They submitted so many different witnesses from the White House and elsewhere to shed light on the president's intent so that Mueller would not need to actually sit down and talk to the president.
Clint Watts, on this issue of precedent, and Phil and his colleagues get into this in the piece. Yes, there wouldn't have been precedent here, but they had an opportunity to create some precedent, to take the fight up to the Supreme Court and figure out what could and could not be done. What do you make of the decision to step away from this? As Phil says, we'll perhaps learn more when this final report is released. But for those who assume that on the issue of obstruction of justice, you needed to hear from the president itself, this was something that was surprising to them.
I was surprised that it did not happen. And consistently over the last 2 years, this has been my big disagreement with a lot of the lawyers that I've been on with here, is there is no precedent for this. So let's stop pointing back, sort of rearward and saying, oh, well, in this year, we didn't pursue this. We've never had a candidate that has been investigated for something leading into the election and relates to whether or not they won the election. So I think the interview needed to happen. I totally understand why President Trump's lawyers were always fighting that, because if it doesn't matter if it's a rally, an interview, he says the opposite of what he said in the last time you asked him a question about it. So I'm not sure that President Trump would even be able to tell you what he thought at any given moment, because he can't remember, or he speaks in the complete opposite direction.
Sophia Nelson, I mean, you read this piece, you think back on recent history, the president welcomed this. Or he said to, at least over and over again. He seemed content to have this opportunity, as he characterized it, to sit down with the man who was investigating his campaign.
His lawyers were brilliant. They earned their pay. I would have never let him talk. Go back to Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton got in trouble when he did that and he started doing stuff. He ended up perjuring himself, right, with something he'd said in the past, and the Paula Jones versus this. So I would have never let my client do it, and his lawyers were good and they earned their pay, and so it was a smart strategy on their part.
Margay, looking again at recent history here, this is different from Ken Starr's investigation. That was an independent counsel. This is a special counsel. Phil's talking about how close-lipped folks within the Justice Department are at this point, but do you think there's a conversation happening now about how this all played out statutorily, who had oversight of what? What's the lesson learned from the way this was conducted, who oversaw it? Indeed, it was special because Rosenstein stepped in when Sessions stepped out, but do you see this evolving, the way in which this republic, this democracy approaches investigations like this?
Well, I hope that people are starting to think about that. The truth is that we're still in the midst of it. It's still unfolding. So we don't really have the perspective that we need yet. My concern over the past week has been the way that this has played out, which has clearly been, if not politicized in actuality, certainly given the appearance of being politicized. And I think that's important because we focus a lot about what Trump's base thinks and what they're doing. But the reality is they are not a majority of the country. And let me tell you how this looks from the majority of the country. This looks like a special counsel that was under the guidance of a political appointee by the person being investigated, who happens to be the President of the United States, has in some way hidden parts of a report from the public that really get to the heart of the state of our democracy and whether or not we're going to bring people to justice or they're above the law because they sit in the White House. So, the idea that this process hasn't been protected in the way that it needs to be on behalf of the American people, that should be a concern to not just Democrats, but also Trump supporters. I mean, if half the country doesn't have faith in the process, then we're all going to have a problem.
Yeah.